Hey guys, today we're going to talk about how Israel lies about the number of civilian casualties it inflicts in its wars based on historical practice. And we'll use that history to argue that Israel is lying today about the number of civilian casualties it is inflicting. Israel claims a 2-to-1 civilian-to-combatants kill ratio in its current war in Gaza. This is a hideous figure already, but there is every reason to think Israel is lying, and the true figure is even worse. To develop this argument, we're going to look at the recent history of Israeli lies about civilian casualties in its wars in Gaza by looking at the two biggest previous wars in Gaza, Cast Lead and Protective Edge. After Operation Cast Lead, which ran from 27 December 2008 to 18 January 2009, various independent organizations, human rights organizations, and so forth, accused Israel of overwhelmingly killing civilians. So over 1,000 of its approximately 1,400 kills were civilians. Israel came up with a much more favorable estimate, radically different. Only 295 of its 1,166 kills, which it admitted to, were civilians. So how did Israel develop such a radically different estimate from all independent organizations? Well, it did so in three deceitful ways. The first and most simple way is simply by undercounting the civilian dead. For example, Israel claimed 89 Palestinians under 16 were killed, whereas NGOs such as B'Tselem had a much higher figure, like nearly 3 times as large. B'Tselem had a figure of 252 children under 16 were killed. And B'Tselem provided birth and death certificates for the vast majority of minors they say were killed, whereas Israel provided no lists, documents, or material to corroborate its much lower figure of civilians and children killed. Israel basically provided a figure with no evidence and no rebuttal of the evidence provided by other organizations, birth and death certificates, saying the figure is much lower. So that's the first way Israel lied, simply providing a sham underestimate of the number of people killed. The second way Israel lied, gained its civilian kill count in Cast Lead, is by systematically excluding 16 to 50-year-old Palestinian males from its civilian casualty figure. If a Palestinian male of 16 or 25 or 50 or 42 was killed in an Israeli airstrike, he was not counted as a civilian, even if he did not take up arms. There's no evidence of any Hamas affiliation. He wasn't counted as a militant either. He just wasn't counted at all. This is a way in which they reduced their civilian death toll by not counting men 16 to 50 killed in airstrikes as civilians, even when there's zero evidence they had any militant activity. The third way in which Israel lied in Cast Lead and engineered an erroneous estimate of civilians killed was by counting all of the hundreds of police officers it killed in Cast Lead, deliberately killed, targeted, as militants. So, for example, scores of police cadets were reportedly killed at a graduation ceremony. This was an attack which commenced Cast Lead, reportedly, as well as traffic police and so on. People with obviously no military role were all labeled militants and counted as militants when they were killed, when they should have been counted as civilians under the Geneva Conventions and international law. It should be noted that while the bulk of reporting states that the bombing killed cadets at the graduation ceremony, there's one police spokesman who said these are police officers who were taking an educational course at this academy. These are presumably civilians, police who kill in war. They should be counted as civilian casualties. The only way they wouldn't be is if they had either taken up arms with Hamas or by themselves, or if the police as a whole had been incorporated into Hamas's armed forces. The 2009 UN fact-finding mission on Cast Lead found no credible evidence that the police had been incorporated into the armed forces and could not even verify that a single police officer had fought in Cast Lead. Obviously, the overwhelming majority of these people killed were civilians. Israel lied by labeling all of them, whether cadets, whether traffic police, as combatants, as Hamas fighters. This was a lie. In fact, many of these people the mission found had no affiliation with Hamas at all, and even political. I mean, even a political affiliation, as long as it wasn't military membership in Hamas's armed forces, should not count, make them combatants. But there are even people who had no political affiliation that are labeled as combatants by Israel. So obviously dishonest, a lie, intended to engineer erroneous figures for civilians killed by Israel. Let me now briefly discuss Operation Protective Edge, which Israel carried out in Gaza between 8 July 2014 and 26 August 2014. Israel killed over 2,200 Gazans. The UN fact-finding mission found that 5% of them were civilians, so it's about 2-to-1 civilians to combatants ratio, completely hideous. In sharp contrast to the UN mission, Israel provided a 36% civilian kill rate for protective edge. So it's reversed. What explains the difference? Well, Israel's lies explain the difference. Israel used the same kind of hanky-panky we discussed of dishonest methods to calculate this figure. For example, Israel again, just as it did in Cast Lead, systematically excluded Gazan males between 1650 from its count for civilians killed in protective edge. If there's no evidence that a 16-year-old boy killed or a 40-year-old man killed had a Hamas affiliation, too bad. He's not counted as a civilian. And that's how Israel engineered, dishonestly, its estimates of civilians killed in protective edge. Now let's talk about the current conflict. Israel claims a 2-to-1 civilians to combatants kill ratio in the current, I call it a massacre, others call it a war, based on Israel's historical practices, as well as inferences from the number of women and children killed in this war, which a large majority of overall kills are women and children, perversely. We can conclude that Israel is almost certainly lying, and the real ratio is considerably worse, probably much worse than 2-to-1, maybe 4-to-1, maybe 5-to-1, or 6-to-1, not 2-to-1. In view of this history, journalists who have an opportunity to interview IDF officials should ask them the following questions about the IDF civilian casualties estimate. First, do you continue to count all 16 to 50-year-old males you kill as non-civilian kills, even when there's no evidence of militant activity? Second, do you count all police killed as combatants, even if there was no evidence they have taken up arms or been incorporated into Hamas? Third, what is your methodology for counting the dead, and how does it differ from that of the Gaza Ministry of Health? Fourth, will you allow human rights organizations and the UN to conduct an investigation of civilian casualties in Israeli airstrikes and rules of engagement in Gaza? And finally, will you cooperate with that investigation? It's time to hold Israel accountable for its lies and to glibly reject preposterous and disgusting claims that this concern about Israeli brutality, which has a remarkable history, an indiscriminate killing of civilians, and war crimes, is simply an expression of racism. This nonsense has to stop, and we have to talk about the actual historical record of Israel.